Back in 2014, I was searching for those photographs of Dr. Wilson when I came across his obituary called The Monk's Roll, written by Professor Walter Holland. However, his obituary had no photograph. And I contacted the BMA and asked them if they had a photograph there, and they said no, it's policy not to include photographs because of copyright problems. So I'd drawn a blank. However, Professor Holland had worked with Dr. Wilson and become friends, and I eventually tracked him down on the internet to the London School of Economics. Again, I wondered if this was a cold trail. Was he actually there still? Because I knew how elderly he was. So I phoned the London School of Economics and found, in fact, that he was there. He was still going into work 1 day a week. And he was very willing to speak to me when he was next in work. He then very kindly gave me Mrs. Wilson's address in Scotland, and I wrote to her asking if she could find a photograph of her husband that we could use for scientific meetings. It's then that her son Stephen telephoned me back in response to the letter, and he helped his mum look for those photographs. This was the start of an enormously fruitful working relationship that I had with Stephen, Andrew, and mostly Philip, Pip. Pip has searched through his father's papers and books in his father's study up in Scotland. And from those searches, much of the information and the photographs in the following presentation have been sourced. And so I, with great delight, invite Pip to come and talk to you about his father and the principles and practice of screening for disease.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I start, I'd just like to extend my thanks to Kate and Peter Schillen and the organising committee for arranging this amazing event in honour of my father. So thank you to all of you before I start, just in case I run out of time at the end. It's been 40 years since Dad wrote the book with Gunnar, and I'm sure he'd be incredibly gratified to know that the work is still standing and is still relevant today. As Kate said, I'm Pip Wilson. I'm Maxwell's youngest son, the youngest of three. I better use this rather than the paper. Dad wrote the WHO monograph, Principles and Practice of Screening for Disease with Gunnar, and it has been described as a public health classic. I think that's true to say, as it's still used as a valid document today and hopefully in the ongoing future. In the book, they observed that whilst in theory screening is an admirable and fairly obvious way of combating disease, they found there were snags associated with it, not straightforward. And so in the book, they go on to develop the 10 principles to make sure that those snags are avoided. How did Dad come to write the book? Well, we aren't completely sure. Dad really didn't talk about his work very much when he was at home, and at various times we met various of his colleagues who came to visit for Sunday lunch at our house, and we had nice meals and chatted, but we had really no idea what they were doing, and they would disappear off and confer after dinner and disappear and never to be seen again in some cases. When I asked Dad, when I was at school, I was asked what my father did for a living. I think it's when I was newly at school. And they were introducing the class, and everybody had to say what their father did. And I said I didn't really know, he was a doctor. But when I went home and asked Dad what I should say in the future, he sort of hummed and hawed a bit and then said, "Oh, just say I'm a civil servant." I think he knew what he was doing, really. Who was my father? Well, he comes from quite a large family. His grandfather, my great-grandfather, Thomas Wilson, was a school teacher in Moniaive in southern Scotland. And his son, James Thomas Wilson, went on to become a very distinguished scientist in his own right. He did groundbreaking work on the reproductive system of the duck-billed platypus, and then finished his career as professor of anatomy at Cambridge University. And my father was the youngest son of 7 children, and I'm the youngest of the 3. My 3 brothers, who I'm proud to say, are here with me. Andrew and Stephen, sitting in the front row there. Andrew with his partner Morris and my wife Leslie there. And so that group of 7 has expanded into an enormously large family across the world now, and many of them have gone down the medical road. None of us did. Andrew is a musician and composer, Stephen's a textile designer, and I wasted my life in the audio industry with rock and roll music. So really we have no idea what we're talking about. Dad was educated at Oundle School, along with his brothers Douglas and John. And all 3 of them went to St John's College in Cambridge, where John studied law and Dad and Douglas studied medicine, whilst my grandfather, J.T. Wilson, was still teaching anatomy there. And they had the delight of being part of my grandfather's anatomy classes, where he came down extra hard on them, just to make sure that no one accused him of favouritism. So he gave them a especially hard time in classes. He was a very meticulous guy, my grandfather. So, turning points in Dad's life. There do seem to be turning points. People Dad met by chance throughout his life. Really, I think, are the key things. Hold on, I'll just go on to my notes here. And yes, I think the idea of preventative medicine probably was something that Dad was naturally drawn to. I think it sort of fitted with his character, the idea of fixing something before it broke, rather than waiting until someone got sick and then trying to cure them. I think those sort of concepts were something that would have appealed to him as a person. And then, as I said, he met various key people by chance almost in his life who maybe turned him one way or another. So in 1954, when I was 2, we were all living in Edinburgh as a family. Dad had been working at the Western General Hospital as a consultant physician, and everything was going along quite nicely. And for reasons we're not quite clear about, there seemed to be a bit of a spat at work, shall we say, and Dad became rather disgruntled with his life there. And so that's one thing to bear in mind. Where we were living, at the house opposite, an interesting chap by the name of Dr Harold Griffith lived, who was an anaesthetist who had been born and educated in India. He graduated from Calcutta University in medicine. So there was an Indian connection there. And Dad and him became friends, and they used to go fishing in the Highlands. And in fact, Dad ended up buying a cottage in the Highlands, which the family still use. And so they became close friends, the Griffiths, who lived opposite. And Joan Griffiths used to look after us when we were small children. And I suspect that when Dad became disgruntled, Harold may have known about someone in India or heard about a job going in India, and whatever the truth of it, Dad ended up accepting a job as a physician in the Dumduma tea gardens in Assam in India. So that was the next part of the story. In 1954 then, when I was 2, Dad booked us all onto the Polish ship Batory on a voyage to Assam in India. Well, I think we landed at Calcutta, where he became principal medical practitioner for the Dumduma tea estates. The Batory was quite an interesting boat. It was called the Lucky Ship. It had taken part during the war and survived various actions and troop evacuations, troop carrying in the Mediterranean and so on, whereas most of them seem to have got sunk. So it was called the Lucky Ship. It wasn't so lucky for me. When I was on it, I was had the end of my little finger, I beg your pardon, my thumb. See how medical I am, I can't even tell which finger's which, was chopped off by a little girl by being slammed in a porthole. And it was, however, a fine opportunity for my father to show off his medical prowess. He leapt into action and stuck it on again with a bit of sellotape or something like that. Anyway, I've still got it, although it does have a scar. So we arrive at Dumduma. This area is in the far eastern part of India, on the Tibetan border almost, adjacent to Bhutan. The name Dumduma apparently is thought to come from the sound of elephants' footfalls. And elephants abounded there at one time before the tea gardens. The tea gardens are in the lowlands on either side of the Brahmaputra, and they're among the largest in the world. And there's a lovely picture of me with my mother in the middle. And so there we are. We've arrived in India, where we lived in this house on stilts, called the Bungalow, but it's quite different to what we call the Bungalow in England. It's quite large and not far from the Brahmaputra river, the sacred river, and we all went for picnics there as a family quite regularly, and quite unaware that mugger crocodiles were lurking all around the place, and we only found out when another family's child went missing one day, and it was suspected that the crocodiles had it. So I think at that point we stopped going there for picnics. By this time, Stephen and Andrew were old enough to go to school, and so they were returned to Scotland to go to boarding school, and I was too small, so I stayed with my mother in India. And actually that picture has got me and Stephen with Mum in a tiny little boat. I hope there's no crocodiles there. Okay, so the reason India is significant is because we come across a chap called Axel here. Axel and his wife Senior were key figures in the construction of the Swedish welfare state. It seems to me he was quite a visionary guy. He was director of the Swedish Medical Board for quite a long period of time. But in 1948, he argued that Swedish public healthcare should shift its focus to disease prevention and monitoring the healthy rather than managing the sick, which is the sort of thing that would have appealed to my father, as I said earlier. Hayer's report recommended setting up a pilot population health screening project, but he didn't receive funding for that until 1961 in the Vermland project. We know that well, for various reasons, we know Axel met my father. Mainly due to this British Medical Association portrait of them together at the same meeting in 1957. So we know absolutely for sure that they met in Drybrugge in 1957. Axel had retired in Sweden and accepted a position professor of preventative social medicine. So he lived nearby to where we were. and families became friends, and here is a couple of pictures of them, Axel and Senior and me and my mother in a tea garden. I vaguely remember snapshot memory of the tea gardens looking like that. And another one of my father, my cousin Mary from Australia, Senior and Axel having tea in the bungalow. Mary's my cousin, and she came over to go travelling with my mother in Bhutan and other places, flying in very rickety aircraft. Unfortunately, after 3 years, my mother became unhappy with her life in India for various reasons, and decided she wanted to return to England. Axel, I think, had been recommending to Dad that if he was going back to England, a career in public health would be a good one for him. So I came home and rejoined my brothers in England, and Dad stayed on for a few months and finished up his work, put his affairs in order, and came back. And we lived in Surrey, just to the south of London, about 30 minutes out of central London, which is where Dad started his job with the then National Health Service, the Ministry of Health. He took up a job at the Ministry of Health as Senior Medical Officer at Alexander Fleming House. There's a nice picture of it there, which was interestingly designed by the Hungarian architect Erno Goldfinger of James Bond fame. Really. His boss was a chap we've already heard from in Peter's presentation, Sir George Godber, who had a habit of selecting young people and helping them in their career and talents. So cherry-picking good people, basically, was one of his modus operandi. In March 1961, George Godber, who is now a Chief Medical Officer, was appointed the UK representative on the executive board of the World Health Organization. So that's an important thing. He'd become aware of the importance of population screening through some of the American work. And so the next turning point comes. Dad is dispatched to America to do a study on multiphasic population screening within the USA and Canada. We've already, from Peter, heard what multiphasic screening means. The thing was that the Ministry of Health and the National Health Service it tries to provide free health care for all according to need and not according to your funds available. And in America, it's different. It's private health care. So the question partly was, how does screening work in America, and how can it be, is it in the same format relevant in the UK? So in April and May 1962, Father visited 97 people in 15 cities, an absolute epic tour of America and Vancouver, which is the only Canadian place he went to. He visited, amongst all those people, Lester Breslow, who we've heard about, Maurice Collin, who we've heard about, Quentin Roman, and Dr. Morton Levin, who also we've heard about. So he comes across a wide number of people who are key in their area of screening. So back in the UK, when he gets back, mass screening, I'm getting ahead of myself there. In 62, mass screening has been carried out for nearly 15 years in the state without it having been possible to make a full assessment of its value as a public health measure for general population. These are part of Dad's words. In his opinion, the reasons for this problem were A, the mobility of the population. People move around a lot. It may not be possible to follow up what's happened to them after their screening tests. The difficulty of welding together a public health screening program which would be continued under private health care, how do those two systems fit together? And C, obtaining a good representative statistical population to take part in the scheme. So those are sort of three key things he worried about. And he writes in the Lancet in July 1952, he reports his findings and thoughts, which included, without a sound knowledge of the natural history of the conditions being screened, trouble can soon arise, and unless treatment reduces illness, only harm will be done by bringing the condition to the patient's attention in the first place, which is an interesting point. This slide shows really the key meetings. It's a timeline of the key meetings and connections that were made from between 1957 and 1968, really, when Wilson and Junger started to write the book. So in 1957, there was a WHO meeting in Amsterdam with George Godber present, representing the UK, and a paper was presented from Lester Breslow from America. In 1960, so that connects those two people. In 1964, there's a WHO meeting in Prague where George Godber is chairing and Gunnar Junger gives a paper, so we know those two meet there. In 1965, there's an NHS meeting at Magdalen College, Oxford, which Peter referred to, where we can definitely put Dad and Gunnar in the same room. So that's a key meeting, really, the key meeting, I suppose. And in 1965, another WHO meeting where Fred Grundy is present, who as Assistant Director General of the WHO, and Dad gives a report. So he hears Dad, and we suppose is impressed. And he then goes on at some time between 65 and 67 to commission a paper for the WHO, a briefing paper on the early detection of disease. So that's how we think the events sequence and meetings happened that brought us to the point of the book being commissioned, if you like. This was a slide showing part of the minutes from the Oxford meeting in 1965, where Dad presented, and part of his paper was this table which shows 10 requirements, as he called them then, for satisfactory case finding. They're juxtaposed with the 10 principles from the WHO monograph, and to all intents and purposes they're identical. The WHO monographs are fleshed out a bit, but they are pretty much identical. So that's really, as far as we could find, the first imprint of the 10 principles as presented in the WHO monograph. So, back to the people. Gunnar and Dad visited each other. Gunnar came to our house in Redhill in Surrey. I remember it, in fact, as does my mum very clearly, because she was out in the garden mowing the lawn when Gunnar arrived. And he was extremely surprised that a doctor's wife should be mowing the lawn. He said, "Why is your wife mowing the lawn?" Dad had, amongst the things when I was rummaging through the old photographs, I came across these slides. There's an interesting one there. There's Gunnar with Axel Hoyer and his wife in Sweden, and also a photograph which I had no idea what it was when I found it, but when I was digging around on the internet, I found the Vermland Project photographs, and lo and behold, it was the same one. So possibly a slide Gunnar had given to Dad of the test equipment there. So here we have a picture of the book itself, brought about by really international collaboration. So that's what this slide is showing as the input really from Sweden on 2 counts, from Gunnar and Axel, and from Dad from the UK, and from America, from all those people in America. We nearly lost the book, by the way. This is Dad's copy, and I couldn't find it anywhere. But it turned out he'd given it to my brother Andrew, so it was in Australia, so it came over from Australia for the photographs. So Dad, the man from the ministry in charge of screening, he became responsible in his career for commissioning research projects for other people to do on behalf of the Ministry of the Health Service. But he was also invited to give reports and briefing papers at WHO and other meetings where population health screening was being discussed. And those are just some of the meetings there in 1968 in London to discuss dietary treatment of PKU. I won't read them all out, but it just showed that he really had a continuing input into the development of screening. 2 years before he retired in 1976, he was offered the post of Deputy Chief Medical Officer in London because George Godber had retired. Unfortunately, my mum was a bit disgruntled, I have to say. He declined the job and decided he was going to take up a job in Edinburgh, which he did, and with his old friend Mike Heisman at the Scottish Health Service, where he worked until he retired in 1978. And they continued to live just outside outside Edinburgh in Musselburgh, where he finally died in 2006, aged 93. He's a quiet, studious man who loved books, music, history, outdoor activities. He used to love reading stories to us, encouraging us to read. He always used to have an ongoing book we would read in front of the fire up in the Highlands of Scotland. He was incredibly hard-working, and he always left for work about 7, and he'd get home between 7 or 8 at night, have a quick meal and do some more work, and work every weekend. And out in the garden in the summer, he would put his wallpaper pasting table out and have his paperwork on it held down by paperweights, and he always seemed to be working. But he's a wonderful man, and there he is. So, I'll leave you with a lovely picture of him when he was young in Davos in Switzerland in 1947, which I think that is taken from, and another picture from 1975, drawn by my mother when they were on holiday in France. Thank you very much.